All right. So today we are doing an idea cafe on what makes a project game B, or rather game B transition, because are we ever getting to game B? It's a whole other question. So anyone want to start? Usually in the idea cafe, we all take a turn before we have an open conversation, but if we don't want to do that, then it just needs to be a direct idea cafe. But would like to start.
I can start.
All right.
Although I guess I don't feel very qualified. I guess it'd be anything that's exploring the space of Game B or can help us transition to what we think Game B might be like Jubilee said. We don't have a definition of Game B, and it's one of those things that they say once you define it, it's not it anymore. But things that are kind of leading that way. So things that help us to, the Omega rule, where you try and listen for signal in everyone that you can, or things that help us to be more decentralized, be more inclusive, and less rivalrous. So that's what comes to top of mind when I hear that question.
Hello.
Can I say it?
Yeah, go Leo.
For me, Game B is reducing inequality. And for that, I believe what I was saying with Carrie is that Coops are the way to do it. So.
Interested to hear more on that in the open discussion, if you don't want to expand more on it now. For me, a Game B project, it's a lot of what Bentley said, a lot of that it's omni-win, that it's anti-rivalrous. Practicing Omega rule is definitely a good start, lowering inequality. It's like there's the perfect project, I'm sure, that is never actually obtainable, especially right now. And so it's just how many of the interconnecting circles of values do you possess in your project? And the more that we can be transparent and democratic or better or decentralized, there's a lot of qualities that I think are in that sphere, but where they interconnect is the question, right? Maybe you can't do decentralized yet. Maybe you can't do fully transparent yet, but wanting to get more and more towards that side. And also, I just want to acknowledge that I've been up for 10 hours since 2 a.m. My fire alarm went off. So my brain is extra right now. So whoever would like to go next.
Sure, I can go next. So I mean, I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think sort of an overall it being sustainable, which is both like from not damaging things, but then also a model that's able to sustain itself. So actually, like, given that at least in the transition, it has to work in a game A world, working just enough by the game A rules to sort of sustain itself while not being counter to the point of it existing. And to that approach, it needs to be able to compete in the current model and win, however that works, which I think goes towards the working together of the cooperatives, the stuff like that. And when I think about it, it's sort of the best of both worlds from the two competing models that people tend to think about as the only models, where there's capitalism and socialism, and to me, it's sort of the best, where it's competitive enough but not rivalrous, and it's sort of the people working together, but outside of we don't need to use the governments to do it. It's not about forcing it. It's about working together enough to make it work. And that's sort of why it needs to be able to outcompete, because it's not using the government to force that approach on people. It needs to be able to enter the arena and come out on top just by people working together and doing what's necessary to sustain itself.
Okay, I'll go. Right. Everything what you've all said, but look, it needs to be metastable. haha, I don't even know what that means, but it sounded good. I heard Jim Rutt say it once, it needs to be metastable. So, and also heard Brett Weinstein saying that whatever you do needs to be strong enough. So I don't know whether this might mean metastable, but strong enough to withstand any challenges it faces and to be able to get stronger with those challenges. So not being crushed by challenges you may not even thought about, and being able to survive that, but also get stronger as it does that, and maybe take the status quo of what is right at the moment and create something that's different. And like, as I said, everything you said, and transcend and include what's out there already. And yeah, an omni-win, and everyone benefits. It's not just a case of, well, you know, I'm in charge, I'm the boss, so I'll just benefit the most while everybody's working shit hours or what have you. But yeah, so being able to sort of like everybody wins out of it. It's not just a case of someone just takes all the money and runs. It just everybody gets to have a piece of what they put into, and it works, you know what I mean? And as I said, if it can spread out in the, and not just be a project for yourself as well, but also to spread out in the local communities and be able to help them as well. So and not just be standalone, as most Game A stuff is. It's all kind of standalone. You don't want to play out with others. Whereas with a Game B thing, it'd be like, yeah, I'll play out with you, and we'll spread what we're doing. And as I said, and not having everything behind paywalls that people can't access when they need it, and just of that really. So that's, I think, everything I've said. Yeah, and everything whatever you said as well. That'd be good.
Yeah, everything you said, and one point. I think Game A and Game B are like they're on a spectrum, and Game A is like extreme end of the spectrum because it uses just one metric for playing the game. The game being A, B, C, D, whatever, and it's profit. So everything that is done purely and exclusively for profit is Game A. I think that's how we can define it. And then there are various stages of, when there's a company that is kind of for profit, but the profit is side effect of doing something good, even in non-transparent way. That's kind of begin of Game B. And then the extreme other end of the spectrum would be something that is done like completely in a transparent manner for the greater good, for completely regardless of the profits and so on. So something like that.
All right, that was everyone, so we can unmute and have an open conversation for the remainder. It's a record, I think. All 6 people sharing an IdeaCafe and done within 8.5 minutes. That means each of us took less than 2 minutes to share. We got it. We got the parameters for what a Game B project is.
I was just waiting for one person to be like, "You're all wrong. It's this." I'll go again.
It's good. Yeah, voluntary was a big, when Adriel started, I was like, right, I forgot to mention that the solutions have to be voluntary, which is part of the competing Game A, as well as Antifragility, which Carrie mentioned. Yeah.
I do want to go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, I might want to challenge on the anti-fragility part. I think that, well, I guess it depends on where the project is in its stage. Some of our projects will be experimental. They'll be learning things, and those don't have to be anti-fragile. But if when our project is to build something that we hope to last, we'd want to make it anti-fragile. Although now I'm thinking about, you do want to keep things you do want things to be maybe self-destructive, like if their purpose no longer exists, then people should disperse and go elsewhere. That's probably a different theme, I think. But that's what I thought when I was hearing that.
Well, yeah, I understand that, because like, as I said, there's loads of sort of like charities that are set up for a single purpose, right? And then it doesn't become about the purpose what they've been set up for anymore. it just comes about keeping themselves in a job and keeping themselves going, which I get that. So I think maybe if you're building something, like as I said, like so a lot of businesses have gone under due to COVID-19 because they didn't foresee what if they're not going to have any customers anymore. And so I think as Brett Weinstein, you have to have an evolutionary stable strategy to develop one of them. So if your purpose for setting up is to create something that helps people out, and then once that purpose has been sort of like done, I think you should build into it. Right? Okay. So what at the end of the day that we've done this, it's all been finished. We're not needed any longer. I think you need to build into a plan, right? What we're going to do after that. You know what I mean? Because as I said, because if you build that into the plan, and then you're not going to get people going, oh, my job, got to keep my job. You know what I mean? But if you planned and built other stuff around that, so it's not just the one thing. Okay, the purpose might have been the driving force, but you've also things have come out of that have been developed alongside it. So you could have things being developed in parallel. So when that kind of finally happens and maybe that's not working, then fine. But the case of COVID-19, when you know, obviously you're not going to be able to operate the way you wanted to anymore. I think you've got to say, right, okay, we're setting up this. What happens if the biggest disaster on the planet? So I think you've got to be ready for all sorts. And as I said, we get all sorts thrown at you now whenever you try and do something. So I think more than, as I said, I wouldn't call it anti-fragile. As I said, just being able to sort of like withstand challenges. And as I said, to get them challenges that you have to come out the other end stronger. And as I said,
that is anti-fragile.
Yeah, that's
anti-fragile. You're stronger.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is that game B is anti-fragile, but the projects aren't. It's like, you know, if a limb is gangrenous, you cut it off, even though you still want that limb. But if it's going to cause more damage to the being overall, like with Mondragon, the worker cooperative out of Spain, it owns a bunch of different entities. Its goal is to survive, and it brings on companies. But if the company isn't serving its purpose, if it's costing more than it's worth, then they cut it loose. And so I think, like as Bentley said, in the initial stages of a project, you're trying to contribute to the overall. But if it ends up not being worthwhile, then all right, it folds, and that's totally fine, because the overall goal of game B is being anti-fragile. But like, if my project starts to take off and then it ends up being either more trouble than it's worth, or it ends up actually being bad, then it needs to die, even though game B itself still should go forward.
Yeah, it's a lot of what we've been talking about all along, like the individual humans involved in whatever way are anti-fragile, not because they are actually anti-fragile, but because anything we go through, if we have the foundation of our needs being met, we're able to come out stronger, right? We're able to know, like, we can focus on our own genius and our own projects. And so, like, there's a certain amount of anti-fragility for the individuals, and then also the whole, that, like, as a project fails at whatever stage it fails at, including it, you cutting it off because it's got gangrene, that's not a failure. That's just it lived its life cycle and now it's ready to go. That there's a learning process in that because of the transparency and openness, that the next people get to learn something and grow from it, which we're, trying to do here with TogetherTec. Sharing that, yet because of how Game A is so proprietary and you have to keep things hidden, and you have to put on an air of being professional, and you can't make mistakes, and if you do, then oh no, that was part of the whole marketing strategy, and we planned that one, instead of what I hope that we're doing here and learning and growing together.
Well, I think the most kind of different answer was Leo's. I wonder if we could ask him to expand on that.
I don't know if his tech is working.
I will say, when he said it, I initially heard cops, but I'm guessing he meant co-ops. That's my guess.
You're muted, Carrie.
Right. So basically, I had to chat with Leo before, and it was basically about co-ops, and we were talking about co-ops in Brazil, and he was telling me about the place where he was at, there's 2 co-ops and one of them, and his big problem is how do you stop corruption within a co-op, right? So I think the big question for Leo is how to stop, because apparently someone who's running a co-op is quite corrupt and that, and all the money ends up going to him. So how, why, where, when, if you're running a co-op, how do you stop that from taking over? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
How do you get that?
How do you prevent it from happening?
Sorry, Leo?
How do you prevent it from happening?
Prevent it from happening. Can I ask what kind of co-op it is? The one you're
I don't know if it's still working. It was a cat co-op before Uber.
Taxi co-op.
So the worker co-op, like the people who owned the taxis or were driving the taxis owned the co-op.
Yeah. But
Those are two different. Sorry, the people driving the taxis owned the co-op, or the people with the medallions owned the co-op, which just sounds like a taxi company, actually.
The people who own the tax own the co-op. The problem is that you need authorization from the government, local government, and then the local politicians took over the co-op and its profits. Do you understand what I mean?
Unfortunately, with the sound quality,
I think your mic may have switched or something, because the first time you spoke, it was totally clear, and now it's like almost sounding like a speakerphone or something.
Yeah, I changed my device because I wasn't able to hear you guys, and now you are not able to hear me.
Well, yeah. So let's see if we understand. So your example was a taxi co-op where the owners of the cars, and it could also be drivers. There's a taxi co-op, and there was some corruption, and the question is, how do you prevent that in that situation, and pretty much in any kind of co-op? And since a lot of our projects have to do with people cooperating, and TogetherTec is a tech co-op. We've handled avoiding corruption by not having money involved so far, but that's not possible in that co-op and lots of other ones. Yeah, I think that is an important thing. There seems to actually, I've noticed in the last couple of weeks, I've heard of several different groups working on governance of co-ops. So I don't know where the space is most recently, but there seems to be a lot of work on it. And then there's also maybe decentralized is the wrong thing, but autonomous organizations where you have some sort of system that kind of allows everyone to participate equally. So, kind of like, well, we tried to do in the United States is, have no central person in charge. Didn't really work out. Yeah, so processes kind of like that, which I think a lot of times there's boards and stuff like that, so no one person has. I mean, there's still collusion and stuff, but yeah, I think there's a lot of work going on in that space that I would want to look at before starting a new project. I don't know if you've had a chance to look into that yet.
Yeah, I'm looking to government. So my idea is that Montesquieu idea that there are powers that are harmonic and equalized and independent. So we can prevent corruption. That's what I'm developing. But I need to look at other crops to see how it will. Do you understand what I mean? I don't know if you can hear me through my microphone.
It might work better if you type it out in the private chat.
Yeah.
If possible, that's probably the better thing. I think one of the main ways, from what I'm hearing, is like you would need really good transparency. So if somebody was being corrupt, it's really hard to hide it. And then the other side there has to be a way to, replace that person. So if they're, like with the liquid democracy, or, the shareholders eventually voting that person out, or if they're just an employee, then getting rid of that person, some method to sort of uncover it, and then decide as a community, what do we do?
And
That's
then
also important to know, and unfortunately I still don't quite understand what the co-op is, because just calling something a co-op doesn't actually make it a co-op. There are producer co-ops, which sounds like that's almost what it is, that it's like the taxi owners are part of a co-op. But whether if you own one taxi in that fleet or 100 taxis in that fleet, you have an equal vote, because that is a fairly rigorous rule for co-ops. There are some wiggle room if you have a worker slash, consumer cooperative, and you can have a vote for each, or some people have shareholder votes and such. But generally speaking, it's one person, one vote. And so, but even in that, like MEC is a consumer co-op, and it's one person, one vote is Mountain Equipment Co-op. And there's still problems with people taking over the board, because MEC gives you recommendations for who to vote for, and nobody looks into it. So you're just going to vote for who they recommend, which means you have, even if you only have a certain amount of time on the board, they're keeping the people they want in power. It's like the liberals constantly being like, yeah, vote in the next liberal, without actually having the brand of liberal under them. And so the only co-ops I consider actual co-ops that help with democracy are worker and consumer cooperatives. Producer cooperatives are like Ocean Spray, cranberry cocktail. It's like, well, yes, it's great that they have a way to get their cranberries into something and get profit from it, but it's not helping the consumer or the worker. So to me, it's less that.
So Martusz
That's
mentioned
why,
inventing. Oh, there he is.
Just waiting for.
Yeah, I'm here. Just so that's why I guess strictly speaking, democracy is not the best choice for the governance method, because especially if you have many people voting on the same thing, and everyone is not equally familiar with the subject, especially when you have more than 3 people in the co-op, then voting as everyone, one person, one vote. It's not perfect. So what is described in reinventing organizations are different models and different approaches to how governance could work in big, and he describes really big organizations. And it involves not voting, or at least not the company-wide votes. So, and Ricardo Semler is also it's a very similar vibe to Frederic Laloux. And it's also worth taking a look at, because he also has some ideas about something between democracy in a workplace and running it in the best way possible.
Yeah, and when we're talking about alternatives to voting, that's also kind of where Reason Score, my project, comes in, because instead of voting, you're putting down evidence on why you should or should not do something, and thus it gets past that issue where the people don't know what's going on. And you could either have that be part of, instead of voting, you could use Reason Score, because it'll do a score, and you say, oh, if it's over a certain point, then the organization will do it. Or it could just be information available to the voters, and then they could vote on it, depending on how mature and how trustworthy people trust in the system.
Totally. And I think you can't have recommendations because people don't pay attention. So I think you have some method to just really like boil down like maybe what you care about, and then sort of score the people based on that. And it has to be very evidence-based, so that you can say as a member, okay, I care about ethics, and I care about people not trying to line their own pockets, and I care about anything else like the environment, and then score people based on the information available, what it seems like that person is sort of about, and what their history shows, to maybe help summarize it based on that. But like as Jubilee said with Mount Equipment Co-op, if people don't really pay attention, or like if even 10% do, but then the organization makes recommendations, that is then very prone to corruption. Then you just have the people in power are going to recommend themselves, or the person who thinks very much the same, and then even though you're voting, that 10% just can't make up the difference for the 90% of people who aren't paying attention and will just vote how they're told.
However, basically all co-ops, you only get 10% of the people voting. So it's actually somewhat, if you got enough people together, right, 5% of the cooperative, you actually can easily sway the vote because nobody cares. So it's like the board, that's why the board can just recommend people who are like, yep, practicing my democratic right. That part of what a good board does in a co-op, instead of saying, yes, Mary Smith is the person we're recommending, is to say, hey, we know that Bob, Sue, and Mike are leaving, and what we need are these skill sets. And then we think these people have the most skill sets of those. But I like what Adriel said, that like having that actually be more transparent instead of it being Mary. It's like, right, we need someone with accounting, we need someone with marketing, we need someone with this. And then showcasing which one of them has the best marketing, which one of them has the best finance. Maybe there's someone with the best of all three. But
yeah, which like an effective game A board, that's actually how they operate, is they have, a bunch of specs saying here's the skill sets people have, and the more sort of equality based ones will say, like, here's how many men we have, here's how many women, here's how many white people, here's all this, so that you can go you've got your shopping list for, okay, we want people that have these skills and that have these attributes, let's go shopping. And then you go and find, okay, here's 3 or 5 people, and then you can decide between them. And I think you would want something like that, but for it to be sort of a more like not as easy to sway in the direction that people think it's already going anyway, or that the existing board thinks it should, which of course is one of the problems with the Game A board, is they're very much, a lot of the companies are prone to do that, and there's nothing to stop them.
it turns out 10 hours is how long my fire alarm will not beep in between. I'm going to go deal with it, and I'll be back in a second.
So any other thoughts about Game B projects, or do we want to talk about some projects that aren't in game, that shouldn't be in Game B, if we want to be a little bit more critical and rivalrous?
Yeah, or even not necessarily projects, but like attributes that we think might sort of come up, or something like if
Signals,
you were
yeah.
half of the attributes, but if there was one thing that was a part of it, you're like, I don't really think that's Game B. Right? Like, I mean,
Okay.
an obvious example is like if you're based on using slavery.
Right. Yeah. That's pretty easy.
Like,
one.
right? Like even if you, which I guess at that point you could, although I guess you could theoretically be a consumer cooperative that chose to use slavery. Although I think that'd be weird, but it's theoretically possible.
Yeah. Well, maybe not. Yeah, using, but yeah, if you were doing a co-op between people who are currently enslaved,
Right.
then yeah.
Well, no, but that's what I mean by a consumer co-op, right? Like if the people who were voting
right.
for MEC said, yeah, we don't care, go ahead and use slaves, just keep the prices low. Again, that's weird, but like theoretically possible.
They ironically do the opposite and say, no, we really want them to have fair wages, and then no one shops there. Like it's like, so then I'll go next door to Walmart. It's like I want the thing I partly own to be ethical, but then if there's a better price down the street, then we go to the one with the better price, which is the irony.
Yeah. Which, yeah, and I think then there sort of does need to be like some model of, okay, so based on what we voted on, here are the prices. If you wouldn't shop at that price, then change your vote, because we can't be sustainable. Like we're voting on something that is going nowhere and is going to have no impact. Good job.
Which is having the membership have full ownership of that. And I think that happens much more easily in like Bend City, the other cooperative that I'm familiar with, because although you're not voting on mortgage rates and interest rates, at the same time you're watching them and seeing, and they can, like the CEO can set them and the board can set them and decide and change things. And so you are looking at it more within your finances, but still, if you can get a cheaper mortgage at RBC, you might, and get, you know what I mean, and switch it over. But you're more in like, you feel more like an owner rather than like sporting goods where it's like, I'm not going to only shop at Mac. And so making sure that the members are fully entrenched in it too. That like the purpose of MEC is to get your outdoor supplies met. So if you're going to go somewhere else, we need that to be part of the information we're gathering.
Right.
Like, why?
Yeah.
Why are you going somewhere else? So that next time we vote on fair trade.
Yeah, I think you can't vote on like individual slivers because you're going to vote on being as ethical as possible and having low prices you're like, yeah, but you can't get all of those things. So here's a package where we're doing this, and here's how much we're going to pay workers, and here's where the materials are coming from. Here's what things would cost in that model. Would you shop here? No, try again until you get to like, okay, it's not perfect, but maybe it's better than Walmart and better than the options out there, and the price is reasonable enough that people, if they knew the other things that like the actually paying employees well and producers and everything all coming together as a package. Because yeah, the consumers will always I don't think that many people would voluntarily vote for paying employees crappily and using slavery, but then they also just want the lowest prices, and as you said, they'll just go to Walmart. And like, okay, if that's what you would do, then why are you voting that way? Well,
the other reason people aren't shopping at MEC specifically, sorry, Bentley, is that they their quality of goods isn't as good as it used to be. Partly of them not like they're paying people well in China and the places they get it made, but the quality of goods is no longer as good. And because they have basically, or did have almost a lifetime warranty, more people are returning it. Now they're like, and that's a much bigger viewpoint, right? It's like, okay, so we need to have quality goods so the person's paid well, and then how we can't have a lifetime warranty. That doesn't make sense. What does make sense for a warranty, right? How long should a rain jacket last for before it's no longer waterproof? How long? And getting that feedback too is part of it, that data in it. Like, hey, how often do you buy your rain jacket? Why? Because it was stolen. Oh, well, that's different than because it's no longer rainproof. And now I'm going to be quiet and let them talk.
Oh, I was just gonna say I wasn't sure if we were done with that specific item. I wanted to talk about just list out other things that if we saw them as part of a project, we might suggest that project's not Game B, which Adria was kind of bringing up, kind of elimination flags. I kind of struggle with this with reason score because there are some uses for reason score that are rivalrous, that promote competition, but it is a fun competition as opposed to, and it drives you towards cooperation, but it's competitive in the middle, which some people might still say encourages the attitude of competition. So I don't know, it'd be eliminating in that specific project, but if a project is focused on profit, and getting other people, extracting resources, I think would be one of the, and not sustainable, it would be one of the kind of factors that we would look for.
So can you expand on that extracting resources?
Well, or not taking into account all of the what's normally external impacts, right? So a business can produce goods and just dump waste into the environment and not take care of it, and thus we're all paying for their business to be cheaper,
right?
Because we have to suffer the consequences, but it's not in their profit model. So if we knew of a project that was doing that and they're saying, oh, we're not going to have to worry about that because we're just going to dump it, we'd be like,
right. Yeah. I think the question with that is also, how does it compare to its Game A competition? Like if you had somebody that was using slavery or that was, had a bad environmental impact, but if they were like the same or slightly better than the competition and better in other avenues, is that still a negating factor? Or is it sort of the full package? Like, okay, use slavery, but use half the amount of slavery. And the other people, you actually, you introduce some good paying jobs. So it is still slavery and there is still some pollution, but it's better than the alternatives, by at least twice. Is that still a deal breaker? To me, it's not. To me, it's
right. We've talked about
progress.
that. Yeah, we're trying to transition to Game B. So if our requirements is that every project be perfect, then we'll never get there.
To me, the one thing that I'm not quite sure how to word this is something about like where the profit goes. I think if the profit goes to shareholders, so I think that's one of the really bad parts about current capitalism is the whole it being paid out to shareholders, but more importantly, that's the driving factor, the end all be all, and all decisions must support that. I think like some version of that is one of the deal breakers, because that drives bad decisions.
Yes, although if you're not giving profit to shareholders, they're not shareholders.
Right. So it might just be having shareholders.
Yeah. I mean, there are where you have constituents, or you have, and you can own a share of the company and there not be any profits as long as you're okay with that, or dividends.
So I guess like you can have stakeholders, but not shareholders.
That might be something to consider. And then we do need to kind of work on how do you get people to invest in these things, which, value's not just in dollars. So people can be investing in that to have a better world, right? So,
right.
And maybe there are models where there are dividends based on investments. It's just they're not the main purpose.
Isn't being a stakeholder, everyone that's got something to do with the business and what have you? Isn't that what a stakeholder is? That's everyone.
Yeah, so I'm separating stakeholders from shareholders. A stakeholder is somebody who's sort of interested or has a vote. You have to have those, or in theory, right? Like that's normal. But the shareholder, because as Bentley said, if you aren't getting paid out from the profit, then you're not really a shareholder. So, because at first I had said no shareholders, and then we talked about that, that separation. So it might end up being, you can still have stakeholders, right? So in like an employee-owned co-op, your stakeholders are the employees. In a consumer-owned co-op, your stakeholders are the consumers. But in this, the end goal is that it's not about being a shareholder. It's not about having everything be profit-driven, where the end-all be-all is anybody that paid money in wants their maximum investment out.
Right. Okay. No. Okay.
Sorry, Barry, continue, then I'll do mine.
It's just when I've been involved with things and they were talking about stakeholders, you just meant, so it wasn't just the employees or the co-op owners or whatever. It was everything from the customer to the supplier. You know what I mean? That was all I was thinking. And some of them don't have any. You know what I mean? So that's what anything I've been involved in. That's what he said stakeholders with everything. You know what I mean? From anyone who had any interactions with the business was a stakeholder.
True. Yeah. So like even in a consumer-owned co-op, the employees and the partners are still stakeholders, because they sort of have something. They might not be a voting stakeholder, but they are stakeholder. I agree.
In the neighborhood and all the neighborhood, the entire supply chain.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
I
like
wanted to acknowledge that Leo wrote out what we asked him to write out, so that since he doesn't have his mic. Okay. Leo said the government around the world use the system to prevent corruption and people taking control. So I want to develop a framework based on that to increase democracy inside the co-op. As I posted on the group, is that we usually have 3 powers that are independent and harmonious. The first power is the people involved. They vote on an app. They also can dispose the executive. The executive is elected. Depose. Thank you for the executive is elected, and they are responsible to administrate the co-op. The third power is to judge, and their job is to look at the principles and constitution of the co-op, and they prevent malicious, like slavery, from happening. So just also to let you know, Leo, I don't know if you're able to come for the roundtable tomorrow morning, which is like in 21 hours or so. Because that is, maybe you could be in the hot seat and we could talk about the co-op and that is as part of it. And because what my response to this is like co-ops are democratic and they do mimic the governments. And at the same time, to do one as the government when like this is already kind of failing it's almost like, why not play with it? Like, why do you need the executives and the that? Because I don't think that is how co-ops necessarily operate. But if there's a reason for that piece to be part of it, then playing with that is playing with it on a smaller scale instead of on a bigger scale and finding out how to make that work as the 3 executive branches. I can't remember what they are: legislative, executive, and judicial. Or did I put okay? Yeah.
And I think part of it might end up being like almost a translation into this sort of model. So like the executive wouldn't be like a normal executive that you would think about, especially in something like a liquid democracy where they're able to easily depose the executive. You vote together and say that person seems to have the right idea, that they're making some good claims, so we put them in power. But then as soon as they start like, oh nope, they're not doing that, or they are kind of doing it, but they're also completely violating our charter, you can kick them out the next day. And it's not like in current governments where you can lie to get in power and then you can do whatever the hell you want for the next 4 years, and who's going to stop you? I do think that sort of top-down, like if they're being true to their word and trying to get there is some advantage into saying, I'm going to pick that person because they seem like, they have a vision, and you're kind of voting on the full package, like what we talked about with you can't just vote on low prices and no slavery and this and that, because some of them are in conflict. So if you have people saying, here's the vision I have, where we're going to have no slavery and try to pay people well and keep prices here and have this sort of model, then you can say, yeah, that sounds good. And then if either A, they're failing, or B, is weren't entirely truthful about maybe some of the stuff that they were doing, you don't have to wait for that to run its course. You can say, nope, that's not working. You aren't doing what you said. We're going to depose you as soon as possible and replace you with somebody else.
Yeah, I guess it'd be interesting in that if we cover it tomorrow to know what the bylaws are for that co-op. Because that, what you're describing is, well, I guess it's not that standard to have like a legislative branch in a co-op. I don't know. It's usually just a board.
Yeah, it's like the board elects the CEO or whatever the equivalent is. If you don't have the CEO, and
then you
they
have periodic
hire
elections.
them, and the members get to vote on who's on the board. In usually it's a rotating every year to 2 years, 4 years.
I think if the members can depose people, they kind of become the judicial branch, where it's like you have your charter, and you say like, here's the rules that Viola is waving at something, but I'm not sure if she's trying to get our attention or type something out or what's going on, or if he's swatting a fly.
No, it was like no. That was it.
Okay.
I think I was clear. That was a no.
Yeah. But I think because
I'm interested in hearing out there, because I'm fairly familiar with co-ops. Not as familiar with our government, but between us, I'm pretty sure Adriel is. Maybe.
The other caution is that a lot of the government models are great in theory, but no one likes their government, so
yeah.
No one thinks their government is performing well. So I'm not sure if that's the best place to start.
Well, it's also like we talked about the co-op and specifically MEC, and that members then go off and go to Walmart, which honestly we don't want to do, but we do it based on price. Part of that is that we know what MEC stands for, and it's beautiful, but I can't afford it. And I don't know if it's going to break down. And I'm not going to feel as guilty bringing it back to Walmart as I am bringing it back here. But my point is the ecosystem in which MEC is involved in is Walmart, is all of this, right? Including the supply chain and everything else. That creating those, whatever you call them, Adriel, packages, like you're voting on are we doing this, are we doing that? Also making sure that that's visible for things like Walmart, right? And I don't think MEC could legally do that, but we can, right? Like it's like, hey, if especially for a mega consumer cooperative, like, hey, if I'm telling you I'm not shopping at MEC because Walmart's cheaper, then what we want as a consumer base is to know when it makes sense to shop at Walmart. And I want, like, what are their people getting paid? The whole supply chain and whatever is available, putting that into the system.
Yes. On that note, and it's something that I think a lot of people disagree with, but I think that competition is important even in Game B. Because if you could have, for example, 3 different lines at MEC, one is sort of the high end, like the top of the top, it's got everything that you want, but you have to be able to afford it. And then something that maybe tries to compete with Walmart, but while saying it's not going to be as good as the top of the line, but our goal is to be better in every avenue that we can, right? So not no slavery, but less slavery. Not no pollution, but less pollution. So you can say, if you were going to shop there, come shop here instead. The price is comparable, but because we aren't paying out shareholders massive, executive bonuses and all the stuff, it is still going to be better, hopefully.
Yeah.
And then you can start to manage those separately, and they're still competing with each other technically.
And you could have no slavery and no things, but have just lower quality products, because sometimes you don't need something that lasts a lifetime. which so I don't know if they have that or not yet. So yeah, so we could keep discussing Leo's. We put more comments. Go ahead, Martush.
Just one point about it, because no competition at all means also no challenge to the status quo. Which means if we have a product like an aqueduct in ancient Rome, and it's underperforming, it's not the best that can be, or it was the best when it was built, but then competition also means to me that someone comes along and sees potential for improvement. And the way to improve in game A is to make something better and sell it for enough profit. So the better thing replaces, or at least that's the theory, replaces the previous thing. So there is something about maybe not keeping competition, but being able to challenge in a meaningful way what is now with something that is potentially better. So it is kind of competition, but a bit different.
Yeah, and I think that's why they use the word rivalrous rather than competition. They are slightly different. Rivalrous.
Yeah, I like that separation, because I think the rivalrous is where it's a bit more heated and it's a bit like I'm trying to shut you down, as opposed to, like, in theory, my project and Bentley's project are kind of in competition, but we're working together because we're still trying to achieve the same goals. So it's like, and that's where I put in the private chat co-opetition. That's actually a term that, like, I've been trying to use to try to explain what I think it should end up being, which is, like, it could be that Reason Score takes off and Wiki Election falls flat, or Wiki Election takes off and Reason Score falls flat. But Bentley and I are still trying to sort of solve that problem together as much as possible, and to sort of have that chat on what do we think the challenges are, and how would each one of us try to resolve that. And I might give him an idea for Reason Score, or he might give me an idea for Wiki Election that the other one of us couldn't do, but because our end goals are the same, and that doesn't mean that, like, all of a sudden I want to absorb Reason Score or Reason Score absorbs Wiki Election, unless, like, that makes sense, because part of the goal is to have them separate. So they are doing completely different things towards the same goal, like having the 3 different product lines at MEC, where you actually want to keep them separate. And if one of them fails, okay, why did it fail? Should we replace it with something else? Does it not make sense to have 3? But, like, probably having 2 in most cases is sort of the bare minimum in my mind, unless, it's unless one of them is selling 99% and it meets the goals. We're like, oh, turns out we might actually be able to get away with one. But I think, to Matush's point, if later on somebody else says, I have a new idea, they're welcome to start it up and see if it competes. And then if it starts to get traction and people start to switch over, cool, we just found something better.
I'm going to mention the, again, the ecosystem of, like, I know Adriel and Bentley, and I'm all good with them coming together and either creating something or Wiki Election being the thing or Reason Score. But as a third party who doesn't know, that sounds, if you don't understand what cooperation is and what rivalrousness is, it sounds like collusion, right? It's like, well, how do I trust either of you if you don't? And part of that is the transparency of, like, you can see it. You can see that that's not the case. And if you can fully see what Wiki Election's doing and fully see what Reason Score is doing and know that you guys are in co-opetition together, then there is a beauty to that. But I just want to own that, like, people coming in third party, it's like, sounds like if they can't see that.
Absolutely.
Why is Zuckerberg talking to Google? Like, no. That's a whole other level of monopoly.
Yeah, that's interesting, because collusion isn't collusion unless you have a profit motive or some sort of motive that's not doing what's best, right, for the external people. So, because we can't, collusion, I guess technically is only collusion if you're extracting from your customers, I think, or that's the way it means. Whether that's the actual definition of the word, that's the way it's used. So that's an interesting concept.
But it's like the customer, the person to use either of those things, doesn't have to know what collusion actually is, right? So, like, just the idea you guys are talking to each other behind the scenes could be enough for them to think about something like collusion and be like, wait, how do I trust you then? You're Zuckerberg and whoever making decisions behind, instead of what it is, which is like, right, but there's no profit motive. What are we colluding on? Getting information in the hands of the people? Oh no. And that's part of...
Yeah, and they don't have to be correct. You just have to avoid the appearance of even doing that. And I think you're right, that transparency goes a long way towards that. Like being fully transparent about our conversations, with these councils working together where we're cooperating but competing. And then also being very open and vocal about what's different about these organizations where that's actually a good thing. Like not having shareholders. And like we aren't, like any money that comes out of this just goes into the organization to help grow it. We aren't fattening our paychecks by having, our project take off even more. That doesn't personally enrich us. There's no reason to do it except getting more users on our platforms, which of course is our goal. And that's fine as long as it's, as you said, there's some facet of like not personally enriching yourself. To me, that's the main thing. Like, and whether or not that's the real definition, as Bentley said, that's how people, I think, mostly think about it.
I don't know why this is coming up in the moment, but there was just a Twitter thread where someone tried to cancel American Girl because they had a black doll. They're like a slave doll, like wow, and they also had a First Nations doll that was specifically from this one tribe, and of course they tried to cancel it. And the amount of the customers for American Girl who were like, "Are you kidding me? Have you read the books?" It was like she escapes slavery and does X, Y, and Z, and they consulted the tribe, and the tribe said yes, and they get the money. Like that. Having a loyal, and that's American Girl. They're not a co-op. They are not for profit. But because they had created that brand and people grew up with it and were loyal to, they're like, you can't disparage this because they understood it because they were part of the story. And I think that is a certain amount of protection in this, is like, wait a minute, I saw them have the conversations throughout the whole thing. And, or at least heard whispers that I could go and watch it. Who's going to sit through all of that? But that is part of it. Is the more that we are transparent, also there's like a loyalty to the customer base that goes beyond mech, where you're not going to Walmart because it's like, wait, I want to go to one for my reasoning if I'm gonna offload that to someone else. I can't remember what the word is, but.
I guess we're getting down to the last several minutes. We could probably go ahead and see if anyone wants to have any closing things, or we could plan for our meeting tomorrow. Let's see if Leo can make it. And maybe take the hot seat. We can focus.
I have background noise here, so I couldn't quite hear you, Bentley. But I thought I heard Jubilee. I don't know.
So we're just going to see if Leo can make it to the meeting tomorrow and be in the hot seat. So what time is the meeting?
It'll be, I think it's
9 a.m. Pacific Daylight Savings Time. So
either 4 or 1 o'clock tomorrow for Leo. I think it's 1 o'clock for Leo. Can you make 1 o'clock tomorrow? Because I always get my times mixed up, because I think it's 9 a.m. your time, and it's 5 o'clock my time, and I think it's 4 o'clock Leo's time. So, and I don't know what Matusha's time is, but where would be the best place to get information for Leo?
And the
with regards
announcements
to
of the Facebook page. Oh, for the co-op stuff.
Specifically for co-ops and collectives and things that are running and things that are being successful. Where would be the best place to go for getting that? Because I've sent him the peer-to-peer foundation stuff. And
one of the examples that I sort of just recently learned about, and that Jubilee has done about for a long time, it is Mondragon, where that's been a co-op that's actually been very successful. It's actually now, I think, like a multi-billion-dollar company that has a bunch of things underneath it. And I'm sure that, I've read some stories.
However, as beautiful as Mondragon is, it started in the 50s, and it started a long time ago. And so to a certain quality, you can't recreate Mondragon. It's like going back and trying and looking at how would you start a new car company. Let's go look at Ford. What did they do? Instead of what did Tesla do? Right?
Well, you wouldn't look at how they started, but you might look at how they run now. because they're still operating in the current world. They're operating in a game
They're
world.
a giant monopoly. Like there's close to a monopoly in a co-op. Like there's something about it when I'm like, this is beautiful, but you also can't go back to the 60s and 70s and recreate the client's business and recreate it in that way. But there are, I don't know where you are, Leo. I know in like BC in my province, there's like a co-op, BC cooperative for every different organization, and they have free meetings with people to say, like, now they only do free meetings once you're actually ready to get whatever the equivalent of incorporated is, where they in Brazil they what was I saying?
I mean, but there are organizations right now working on governance for co-ops, and it's a co-op for co-ops. I can't remember their names, or I know that I saw them recently. So I can look for that and add it later.
I mean, I'm fairly knowledgeable on co-ops, not necessarily on. I've never started one. I've worked at them. I've shopped at them, and I'm interested in them, including creating the global cooperative, the global tech cooperative. So I'm open to questions and look forward to you being in the hot seat tomorrow. Does anyone have any closing statements for now? What makes a Game B project a project Game B? Just do it, fail, and help us all learn. And like, let's not use slavery, but other than that, let's just move forward and see, is it an improvement? And as long as we're transparent and open, I think we're good.
One aspect that I almost never heard about before is the ability for a DAO or the project to be dissolved when it's done and completed. And this is especially important because usually, and by usually I mean always, when there is a problem and a project arises to fix it, it establishes itself as a thing, company, organization, something, which fixes the problem potentially, but then because it exists, some amount of energy it has, it's diverted towards self-preservation. And then it exists and it starts looking for other problems to solve, and it's not necessarily the best. It's like when you have a nail and you build a hammer to do whatever you want, but then you have a hammer and then you look for other nails and you tend to look at problems as nails. So you may end up applying the wrong tool to some problems that would be better if better fixed if a new tool was built, and after the specific purpose ceased to exist, the tool ceased to exist along with it. Yeah, that's my statement.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, I think that is like a bit related to the anti-fragility conversation earlier. Like the game B overall should be anti-fragile, but not the individual projects, because they can be allowed to fail, and they should be allowed to fail. And a lot of them like should end up failing or dissolving or whatever. Like either they didn't do it or they did it, and now they don't need to exist because, or like they can still exist, but at 1/10 of what it was. Because if you did a bunch of research to figure out how a hammer works, and then you built it, and you're like, okay, but now all we have to do is build them and maintain them. 90% of this isn't needed anymore. And that's where it probably helps to have almost like a parent company. Right. And that's, I guess, kind of one of the advantages of something like TogetherTec is you have that shared resource where it might be, okay, we put people on the hammer project, they built one, great. Now there's a small team that maintains that, but then you move 90% of those people over to a different project. Hey, now we need a new screwdriver, go.
And I think that is like having the conversation in the beginning when you are incorporating, when you are, is like, when are we done? When are we done that mission? And sometimes like for the things I'm doing with solution raising, where it's like 10,000 people and $100,000. Now I'm like, great, but when do you stop it, right? Because the idea is the 10,000 grows and grows and grows. But if we create a food one and then someone else creates one in 10 years, but there's going to be a tiny group of people who are like, no, but I don't know, I want this one because it's the one I'm used to. So what's the threshold that requires this for it to stay in existence. It's definitely a cost to how much does it cost to maintain it? And then, you know, one person, if it's costing $1 million a year to maintain it, no, if there's 1 million people, yeah, we could probably do that. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you. It sparked something. So any other closing statements before we say?
Oh, protocol.love, which we've talked about here before, is also fits into that kind of governance, I think. I'll include some links later on.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow morning for the roundtable or whatever time that is for you.